Morning, my name's Henry Easterbrook. I work for Hydrock. We're doing a webinar this morning looking at net zero and what are the opportunities specifically in relation to funding. I'm joined by Alex Chalkley at Venturenomix. I'll let Alex introduce himself.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining. Alex Chalkley from Venturenomix. I'm here to talk in a bit more detail about grant funding opportunities for net zero.
Thank you, Alex. Okay, so thank you all for joining. It's a pleasure to have you in my home this morning, and I've had a shower and got dressed especially for this, so you should feel slightly privileged. This is the second of a series of webinars that we're doing about net zero. If you're interested, next week on the 2nd of June, we're talking about the climate emergency and how that might play out in the local planning system with Rebecca Lydon. And then on the 4th of June, we're looking at the route map to net zero with Chris Scott. Further details available on the website. So we've already introduced ourselves, but it's myself, Henry, with less facial hair, and Alex. Hydrock is a very quick rundown. Hydrock's a multidiscipline engineering business, around 500 staff, UK-wide coverage. We offer the full range of engineering services, and we try and differentiate ourselves with a slightly more human approach and a much more user-friendly service than maybe some of our larger competitors. I'll let Alex introduce Venturenomix.
Thank you. Yes, Venturenomix is a consultancy focusing on strategy and funding for impact ventures, so good projects. I've been working in the sphere of grant writing in particular, so research and development and impact economic growth grants since 2009, so hopefully be able to impart some useful knowledge with my slides in 10 or 15 minutes or so.
Thank you, Alex. So what we thought is that with the significant emphasis and effort that's going towards decarbonisation, net zero transition, we're trying to think about what questions clients and industry stakeholders might be asking. So a few of the things that we thought might come up. Net zero, is this a cost burden that's going to make things more difficult, or is it a value proposition? Is there opportunity around commercialising decarbonisation? What's important when attracting responsible investment? Are we seeing the emergence of a new asset class around energy decarbonisation? How might we claim our share of the £2 billion a year in UK government grants? What might be involved in the future proofing of the real estate environment in a rapidly evolving social and regulatory change? And is it possible to create value without capex and balance sheet liability? So that was some of the thoughts behind what we were attempting to cover, and we'll go into that in a bit more detail now. And of course, sorry, the alternative forms of funding and the eligibility thereof. So just to set the scene slightly more broadly, I think most people are probably aware the UK government has committed to decarbonising, being net zero carbon emissions by 2050. There's a difficulty in maybe understanding exactly what that looks like, and there's probably even more complexity in understanding what the route map to getting there is. We do have a more detailed webinar on this next week, but just to give you a very whistle-stop summary, the key milestones are probably around the carbon budgeting. So in 2020, we were obliged to achieve a 37% reduction in carbon emissions from a 1990 baseline, and actually that was achieved quite successfully, almost entirely by the taking offline of coal-fired power stations. But from here on, it gets much more difficult. In 2025, we're looking for a 51% reduction, 2030, 57. And the message is, the further you go, the much harder it becomes. If you're interested in looking at this in any more detail, there's an excellent academic report called Absolute Zero, which looks at the the challenge of true net zero. But to give you a high-level summary, there's legislative change along that journey, with government withdrawing their opposition to onshore wind earlier this year, which is a key step. There's the Future Home Standard 2025, which will be a worldwide leading standard for energy efficiency of homes, and will include the banning of gas boilers in domestic dwellings as well, which is quite a significant move. And then ahead in 2040, there's the internal combustion engine vehicle ban, with some local authorities seeking to legislate a ban ahead of that time. Regionally, there are very ambitious targets set to decarbonise ahead of 2050. So London, Manchester, Brighton, Bristol are all setting their own targets around 2030 or shortly after. And without wanting to knock the ambition, there's generally a lack of meaningful plan around how that might be delivered. But we support the ambition, and we look forward to being part of that journey. Meanwhile, distribution network operators, the likes of Western Power and UKPN, are starting major reinforcement programs to allow for the infrastructure for the electrification of heat and transport. In terms of technology, 5G deployment is enabling an interoperable data network, which will be the platform for smart cities. 2035, we will have a zero carbon gas network, which in practical terms means the replacement of some existing pipework with plastic pipework to accommodate hydrogen. 2045, we're expecting hydrogen and biomethane significantly to increase, and that's because by that time there will be an excess of renewables on the grid. So quite process energy intensive forms of energy such as hydrogen will become more viable as there is excess renewable energy. So that's a real high level scene setter. In terms of funding, we thought we'd start from the very top. So institutional funds have such influence over all that we do. And I think it's worth just trying to set the scene slightly more broadly around what that means. So in terms of the hierarchy, the Article 2.1c of the 2018 Paris Agreement set the standard in terms of recognising the role that finance plays in climate change. And as I quote, making finance flows consistent with a pathway towards low greenhouse gas emissions and climate resilient development. So effectively that statement, that vision has to be followed and adopted by all the institutional funds that operate in this world. And with that, we've seen the remarkable rise of responsible investment or impact investment, where essentially there's a broader societal betterment, and it's believed that there is a correlation between that and financial performance. And to give that some context, a real world example, BlackRock, one of the largest institutional fund managers, $8 trillion of assets under management. They will only invest in sustainable assets now, and they have a clear vision and purpose around all of that. Now, where this has stepped down into a more corporate level is around ESG, environmental and social governance, strategies and policies that form the analysis of decision making on investments. So where there's competition in deciding what investments look a good prospect, maybe historically it was about financial performance alone. Now the ESG analysis will be pivotal in deciding which projects are successful. So ESG, environmental, social governance, the environmental metrics are generally based around energy, carbon, waste and water. The social metrics are people related, whether that be stakeholders, policies around diversity, supply chain engagement and clients. And then governance is corporate structure, share class, policy and strategy, and essentially how well businesses run, how purposeful it is, but also how authentic it is. So investment decisions are based on broader societal impact, not just short-term fixed tenure financial performance. And I think this is a world that we've seen, a change that we've seen in the world in recent years anyway, where the short-term pursuit of personal financial gain is generally at the detriment of long-term value, and it's refreshing to see the old money of institutional funds recognising the value in this. So ESG has proven, interestingly, to predict financial performance. There's some good examples of governance breaches, if you like. You know, the example of Facebook with their data breach, and Equifax. You know, the conduct of those organisations was detrimental to their financial performance, and the ESG metrics pick that up ahead of the financial impact being priced in. Also, there's a really strong sentiment emerging, particularly among the younger generation, for demanding that their pensions are invested in something ethical, not supporting oil and guns. So the money that's flowing into projects that we might be involved with has to have a greater level of social purpose. So at a project level, day to day, screening processes are adopted, and those projects or those organisations that lack the environmental credentials will limit the investment appetite and suppress value through priced in risk. So projects credentials are pivotal in attracting investment and maximising value. Another facet of funding in relation to decarbonisation is carbon offset. So I wanted to try and explain the broad principles of that and give an example of one of the carbon offset funds that's operating. So carbon offset is the reduction of carbon emissions to compensate for emissions made elsewhere. From government to individuals, payments are made to offset emissions from transport, electricity use and other sources. This has exceeded $5 billion US. The money is used to support environmental and social impact projects worldwide. And at a more regional level, there are allowable solutions in local authority planning policy. So any new built environment projects require us to minimise emissions, incorporate building renewables, but any residual balance of carbon reduction to meet a target emission rate have to be paid for through allowable solutions, effectively a contribution to carbon projects off-site. So for context, in Bristol, Bristol City Council are currently accepting carbon offset at approximately £95 per tonne over 30 years, so £2,850 per tonne capitalised, which is broadly comparable with capital cost of solar. A number of carbon funding schemes exist, funded with a mix of carbon tariff and institutional money. A good example, which I'll go into in a bit more detail, is the London Mayor's Energy Efficiency Scheme, catchily named MEEF, which is a £500 scheme. This can provide corporate or project financing, can provide senior debt, mezzanine debt, or equity depending on the requirements of the project. It can also provide framework of loans which can be used for numerous smaller projects over a period of time, as well as funding for individual projects. Typical investments range from 3 million to 20 million, but they will consider investments of $1 million plus, and with terms of up to 19 years. And importantly, no match funding is required, so 100% of the cost can be covered. A broad range of technologies and interventions can be covered: decentralised energy, mobility, most likely relating to electric vehicles, energy infrastructure, and energy efficiency projects, which can include fabric and systems retrofits, so refurbishments effectively. MEEF is targeting a socio-economic return as well as a financial return while addressing market failure, so those projects that wouldn't get traditional private sector finance. The requirements to satisfy are at least one of the following: a decrease in energy consumption, decrease in CO2 creation, or the creation of renewable energy capacity. So broadly speaking, to make it sort of meaningful, this can get you up to £14,000 per tonne of CO2 saved, and a payback of up to 19 years actually means like-for-like replacement of existing can comply. So it's a commercial opportunity as well as a good ethical cause, possibly with applications for refurbishment schemes, office and other tenures. Other schemes and funds include REFIT, which is the NHS version of carbon reduction retrofit programme, and there are funds like Salix and Equitex and EEF, which perform similar services. I'll hand you over now to Alex to talk about grant funding. Thanks, Alex.
Thanks, Henry. So I guess to start with, why are we even interested in grant funding in this context? I mean, apart from the obvious of it's as close as you're going to get to free money, it does have some benefits. So in terms of potentially unlocking development funding, grant funding can be a really useful barrier breaker to get that institutional funding flowing, as that Henry was talking about. And also in terms of recognition, so third-party recognition for what you're trying to achieve. So just a couple of thoughts on why it's worth going after that, why it's worth going after the grant funding. Essentially, grants are a mechanism to implement government policy or government priorities. It could be decarbonisation of the economy. It could be looking at increasing productivity, which is always a hot topic. It could be increasing jobs, obviously currently in a response to the pandemic. So it's a way of nudging, encouraging businesses to behave in a way that the government would like to see. It's important to understand state aid in the context of grant funding. Essentially, state aid means what support a government on a national level can give to organisations, businesses, and there are pre-agreed state aid levels. It's essentially to ensure that competition is fair across the country, across the EU, and the main reason I would suggest to understand state aid is it affects how much, what percentage of your total project can be supported with a grant. So for example, if you find a state aid mechanism that would allow a grant funder to support legally 100% of project costs, then you can get 100% grant funding, and that would be obviously a desirable outcome. I'll give you a practical example of state aid. For example, if you are building an office block, then the state aid mechanism is an intervention rate of 20%. So of your costs, you can claim 20% grant. However, if that office block is an innovation centre with a touch of marketing magic dust and some meeting some requirements, then the state aid intervention rate is 50%, and therefore you can cover half of your costs. So just one example of why it might be worth checking into that. Incidentally, on state aid, and Bristol was mentioned earlier, there is an excellent state aid lawyer. If you're interested, message me after the webinar and I can put you in touch. So grants are coming from government departments like Business Energy and Industrial Strategy or Innovate UK. I checked on the government grant portal this morning. There were 157 live grants, of which 57 were related to construction and 67 looking at science and technology. So a good number, and that is not unusual. Before the UK left the EU, then I would be talking about, potentially up to 2,000 live grants that you could look at that might be of interest. There are a couple of requirements, a few requirements that grant funders will expect of you. and I'll cover two particular types of grant that might be of interest: research and development, and impact, social impact, or economic growth. So if we could jump to the next slide, please, Henry.
Yeah, all done.
Thank you very much. So looking at research and development grant funding. So R&D is defined as bringing a new product, process, or service to market. So progressing through that concept to maybe developing a plan, an MVP, a minimum viable product, a prototype, testing, demonstrating, and then you're at the point where you're confident that it can work commercially. That whole stage of R&D would qualify for research and development funding. It's critical in order to access R&D grants that you can demonstrate two parallel tracks. One would be that your project is novel, innovative, potentially high risk, to demonstrate that there's a new technical approach that is risky enough to justify public money in the form of a grant, as opposed to funding it yourself or through revenues or through private investment money. The other track is that there needs to be demonstrable commercial potential. Ideally, the solution could be demonstrated once and then rapidly scaled. There needs to be some thought about revenue generation and the proof that you can commercialize this through your existing team or network of relationships. So novel and commercially viable, those two things are important to consider. I touched briefly on state aid. So under research and development, any SME can get an automatic 70% contribution of grants to their overall project, and large companies can get 50% contribution. I mean, it's a generalization, but that's a good place to set your expectations. To give you an example of an R&D grant fund that could potentially resonate, we've done some work with an architect's firm and an energy supplier and a logistics company around looking at future of car parks. So with the advent of e-vehicles, e-mobility, and the requirement for, it's not too far down the line, charge points, car parks need to be considered, especially with autonomous vehicles in a similar way. So that is conceptual at this stage, and it would be entirely reasonable to define a research and development project, a feasibility study that would enable you to fund the design, planning, specification, energy load, site location, just to find a few £100,000 maybe to plan that project, to de-risk it before you then take it to prototype stage or demonstration stage, where you might then unlock the investment funding to make that happen. So a couple of tips. It makes sense to partner if you can on to secure R&D grant funding. Your chance of success will increase if you find an academic partner, potentially a university, or an industry partner who can demonstrate a route to market. Be really clear about your problem and solution. So what problem are you trying to solve, and what solution are you putting forward? Define the current state of the art. So what is the current best in market solution? And imagine that your solution is then deployed, viable, and point out the USPs and why yours would be why yours would be advantageous. And the final one would be try and keep as many costs in-house as opposed to outsource to subcontractors, because that's going to demonstrate good value for money, which is one of the key requirements of any public funding. Right, next slide, Henry, please.
Yeah, done.
Thank you. Right, so research and development is one area of grant funding, early stage, and the other one that is potentially of interest is social impact or economic development. In the main, these grants are regional, more for capital projects. So buildings, installations, and so on. They are generally more available in struggling areas of struggling geographical areas. So if you have potential projects in areas that have been identified as requiring public support to improve job prospects or industry, these are a good opportunity. To give you an example, we worked with a developer last year, maybe 18 months ago, as part of a wider development or redevelopment in Wrexham. There were two significant size car parks, and there was a grant funding opportunity to install rooftop solar to the tune of 2 megawatts in total. And we were able to secure the, forget what the amount was, somewhere around £1.5 million to fund a good chunk of the installation of the solar. And that really helped. As soon as we got that funding in, there was an immediate follow from the institutional investors who appreciated the business case that solar presented in terms of running costs for the wider development, lifetime costs, and so on. The priorities for impact funding generally are jobs and economic growth. So it is likely that for X £1,000 of grant, you would need to demonstrate gross value add or job creation or productivity increase as a ratio. And that was going to be one of my tips, actually. I would speak to the funder, and they will generally tell you what kind of ratio they're looking for. Is it one job created over 5 years for every £10,000 of public money spent? And that will really help your chances of success if you're hitting the ratios. The funding rate is slightly less generous than R&D grants, so you're looking at somewhere between 10 and 50% of project costs to be covered, but then they will cover capital costs as opposed to R&D grants, which tend to look more at wages and staff costs. So my quick tips for this one is get the state aid early with the state aid advice early with the social impact economic growth grants. Again, the difference between getting 25% for an office block and 50% for a innovation centre and office block can make a big difference. You need to be able to quantify the impacts of what you're doing. So whether there is impact studies that you've done, or whether it's a team in-house that can justify the outcomes of the project, get those in early, and then yes, finally find out the ratio that the funders are looking for. There are a few useful links where you can that I'm happy to share, maybe in a follow-up email, where you can find grants and read a bit more. I'm obviously very happy to take a call about specific projects, and I'm sure contact details will be shared. And we've got a Q&A at the end, Henry. I think that's right, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right.
Great. So I'll jump off there and hand back over to you.
Cool. Thanks, Alex. I wanted to explore the potential for energy as a service and DBFO-based procurement, which are both linked. So in the instance of end users who could realise value from decarbonisation in some form, but are either unable or unwilling to foot the capital cost, or would prefer not to have the balance sheet liability that goes with it, there are a range of organisations, including funds and energy performance contractors, who will deliver projects on a DBFO basis, so design, build, finance and operate. These organisations will hold some or all of the revenue and the asset value, but this means the user can realise the benefit of these interventions without the millstone of the cost and the balance sheet liability. So to give it some context, the type of projects this might include, and this is by no means an exhaustive list: heat networks, energy centres, modernisation of ports, airports, university, energy infrastructure. The electrification of bus depots is a particularly hot topic at the moment, with the move towards EVs in respect of buses. Multi-technology solutions such as a combination of street lighting, electrical vehicle charging, Internet of Things monitoring of perhaps air quality or vehicle movements, 5G nodes, vehicle-to-grid charging, vehicle-to-vehicle charging, and energy storage. The combination of all of those things combined would be something that could be delivered on a DBFO basis. Community energy schemes, off-grid solutions, smart grids, microgrids, also multi-technology renewable projects, ideally with power purchase agreements in place or private wire potential to adjacent users, only add to the viability of those kind of projects. Energy storage, batteries are on the cusp of a battery storage revolution, and there is significant opportunity for end users to have behind the meter energy storage, which will allow them to shift loads and participate in energy arbitrage, which is the principle of buying energy when it's cheap or even negative pricing, and then using it or supporting the grid at times when the grid is under stress and it's much more expensive. So this is still, DBFO is still an asset-based procurement of capital works, albeit the risk associated with the design, the building, financing and operation are held by others. An interesting next step, fairly unique to energy decarbonisation, is the principle of energy as a service. So energy as a service approach shifts from an asset-based focus to a centralised energy generation. Shifts from asset focus and centralised energy generation and the sale of it to passive customers. Instead, it offers an end-to-end management of a customer's energy assets and services. So by aggregating clients' resources into large smart energy community, energy as a service providers can merge markets, offer predictable load balancing, upgrade the grid in a number of different ways, offering economies of scale to clients and the allocation of operational risk where it can best be managed. And as a final slide from me, I'm really interested in the prospect of energy assets featuring more broadly in mixed-use real estate developments. So could energy feature more prominently in real estate developments? Multi-technology energy assets can deliver value which is complementary to property, and importantly, whilst leveraging sunk costs such as land acquisition, legals, planning, grid connections, which the property development would require anyway. So energy assets can deliver value through 5 key themes, which I'll explain very briefly. Revenue, so creating additional income by developing a tradable asset, which plays the capacity markets and a range of other mechanisms to derive an income from supporting the grid and taking off load at excess supply times and the energy arbitrage, energy arbitrage principles. There is obvious cost savings from the reduction in running costs and distributed energy solutions. There is the decarbonisation or the CSR benefits of switching your power usage to less carbon intensive methods. There's a significant opportunity around overcoming capacity constraints. So if there's a development which is unable to get the required power from the grid, an energy intervention would allow a development to work within the available capacity through a mix of generation and storage. And it provides significant resilience in a world that seems to be moving back towards power outages, including some significant examples towards the end of last year. Increasing emphasis on power resilience and power quality is important for a lot of clients. So just to see maybe what this might mean, so I'm trying to give it some context. A speculative urban office scheme, if it were to host a battery, it would be able to benefit from all 5 themes: revenue, cost savings, decarbonisation, capacity and resilience. A strategic land site wanting to mitigate the risk of some of the early capital investment, maybe 10 years ahead of actually being able to realise any value from the property, could host an energy project, either as an owner or as a landowner for someone else who's hosting that site, and that would deliver some capital returns very, very early in the project life cycle, which would offset significant finance costs through the life of the project. A port, this is a very topical one, a port wanting shoreside power. At the moment there's significant public health and air quality issues around ports because ships come into berth and run their auxiliary power from their heavy oil engines, which creates significant problems across cities, Bristol, Southampton, a number of others. Like aviation, if you can have fixed electric power, which can be charged to the ship users, and also if you can have non-fossil fuel materials handling and cranes around the port, there's a massive advantage there, but typically there's no grid capacity, so an energy project could overcome all of that and deliver value. Industrial process buildings with consistent and predictable peak power demand can offset their demand at peak times and actually support the grid, and in doing so probably negate the bulk of their energy costs. The classic bus terminal switching to electric vehicles, the profile of bus charging doesn't match the peak profile of the grid, because typically buses are out ferrying people around at times when the grid's struggling. So there's a significant opportunity there. So that's just to try and give it a little bit of context. We'll jump into some Q&A now. I ask politely if you could leave your name, and we can always get back to you if we can't cover all of the questions. And just a final reminder, there are further webinars next week, and there'll be a recording of this for anyone who wants to watch it again or share it with others. So just bear with me while I have a quick look at the questions. Alex, I've got one for you here. Are the grants available in Wales?
Yes, so good question to start with. Yes is the answer. Particularly, I mean, first of all, the research and development grants are available all across Wales, equally with England. In terms of the impact grants, then really it's about transition areas. So south of Wales in particular, but anywhere where kind of transitioning from older industry into new opportunities, and where there are areas of deprivation, then certainly a good number of regional development grants would be available.
Excellent, thank you. I've just published another one. Alex, can local authorities apply for any of the UK grant funding?
Yes, they can, and it comes back to what I was mentioning about partnering. So it's not just single entities that can apply. In fact, it's advantageous to put together a consortium, so that might be a local authority, a developer, an organisation like Hydrock, and funders potentially, and then that opens up a good number of opportunities that might not be available to you individually as local authority, but collectively you could then become eligible.
Fantastic. I've just noticed one here. What kind of opportunities for smart energy and social housing? Social housing presents a significant opportunity given the scale of their estate, but also the interesting dynamic you have of the tenants and occupiers. So as Hydrock, we've undertaken some work recently looking at the lifetime value implications of alternative forms of heating and hot water and the transition from gas to electricity, which is interesting, and there's much more to it than just the running costs and the operational life cycle implications. But I touched upon energy as a service earlier. I think social housing is a perfect example of where that could work. Some social housing providers have many thousands of units, and those are typically managed on a piecemeal basis. So energy as a service would effectively allow the tenants to pay for their energy usage and other things like broadband on a subscription basis. So you pay for 200 lux in the living room. In terms of light levels, you pay for 21 degrees for 10 hours a day, and you pay a monthly charge. And then the economies of scale from the energy as a service provider would find efficiency in the management of that whole estate, which would be difficult to realise on a piecemeal basis. I've got a new one for you, Alex, just published about the timescales. So are you able to provide a benchmark for how long the grant application process takes from submission to award?
Yes, I can. I can break that down for you. It is not just one size fits all. With the research and development grants, the turnaround is reasonably quick. So UK R&D, the main funder is Innovate UK. I've posted a link in the chat. I don't know whether that's publicly available yet. From deadline to decision is approximately 8 weeks, and then typically there are 2 to 4 weeks of paperwork and setting up the project. So 3 months from submission to project start in an R&D grant. If you're getting involved in a collaborative research and development project in, say, a smart city group, which is potentially pan-European, then that could extend to about 6 months. With the impact grants, it varies quite significantly. So that solar project that I was talking to you about in Wrexham, I think the initial feedback came within a month after submission, and there was then another 6 weeks of a few questions backwards and forwards before a decision was taken. So I would allow 2 to 4 months in that situation. So yeah, I would suggest 2 to 6 months, 6 months really being on the outside.
Fabulous. I've got one here. I'll just pick up quickly. What are the best resources to find locations where the national grid is most stressed now and in the future? So to answer your question, a slightly different question to the one that's asked. National grid, there's more complexity to that, and that data isn't widely available. But DNOs, distribution network operators, the likes of SSE, Western Power, UKPN, are now publishing areas of network constraint. So for them, there is a good opportunity in providing smart energy solutions in lieu of network upgrades. So where there are physical constraints preventing them from upgrading the substation or the cables, they will pay private companies to provide additional generation or storage, or even switch off demand at peak times to negate the need for the network upgrade. And that information is generally more available. Western Power is one of the better ones. So they have a system, the name escapes me, but I can follow up with this detail, where you provide a postcode and it will indicate areas of physical constraint and network constraint, which would indicate where the best opportunities are. But just to explain a little bit more broadly, understanding where there are areas of constraint is the work of power developers, and understanding where an energy asset would perform best is the IP of aggregators who understand what revenue can be sought from energy trading, energy producing assets. So it's difficult to pinpoint exactly what that is, but certain assets will perform extremely well in certain locations. Very vague answer, sorry. We'll take one more because time's running on. Okay, let's have it. I'll take this one. So, do you think uncertainty around policy decisions for how we get to net zero will be a barrier to funding proposals? And this is a really interesting topic. So, what's constraining the energy sector is lack of certainty, and that's around funding and regulation uncertainty. The funding is hampered by the potential change in regulations. So, for example, energy storage wasn't really considered within the UK regulatory system. Investment decisions around energy storage assets have significant risk attached to them because we don't know how that legislation will evolve. So that's just one aspect. I think if we're to provide greater certainty for funders, that will allow the money to flow and net zero to progress. So policy and the regulatory certainty that flows from that is absolutely pivotal first step in delivering all of this.
Yeah, and from the grant side on that, Henry, it might be a little clearer in terms of the research and development grants. So bringing those new products, processes and services to market, there is an agreed government strategy, which, as far as I can tell, is not politically motivated, but more playing to the strengths of the UK economy and looking at where we might need that innovation in order to deliver that net zero. And specifically on that net zero, the driving the electric revolution is one grand challenge, as they've been dubbed. And then industrial decarbonisation, manufacturing made smarter, probably are the ones that are, and transforming foundation industries. So, I mean, as you can hear, they're very broad topics, but certainly that 2 billion annual R&D grant funding will be funneled in the main into those sectors.
Fantastic, thank you. It's kind of the big question on everyone's lips, that one, so it's an interesting one. We'll wrap things up there. Just a final reminder that there's 2 more webinars next week in relation to planning policy in context of net zero and the route map to net zero. So please go to the website or LinkedIn to see further details. Thank you very much for joining, and thank you, Alex, for joining the webinar as well.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Henry. I'm happy to connect offline as people would, if and when they would like.
Cheers. Thanks all.